Hey everyone, I'm Vince. Welcome to my channel. Here I do a variety of things, but one of the things that I do the most is to summarize important books or ideas that I think you should know about. I try to give a pretty straightforward summary so that regardless of if you agree or disagree with the author, at least you can understand what they're saying. If you like content like this, I'd love for you to subscribe. If not, you can show your support by hitting the like button. Today I'm going to look at the book Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. This book was written in 1949, so into the era of Jim Crow, and it's sort of an apology for Christianity, apology in the sense of a defense. This is the book that it's said that Martin Luther King Jr. carried around with him whenever he went from place to place. So the big problem that Thurman's dealing with, he says it like this in the prologue: why is it that Christianity seems impotent to deal radically and therefore effectively with the issue of discrimination and injustice on the basis of race, religion, and national origin? Is this impotency due to a betrayal of the genius of the religion, or is it due to a basic weakness in the religion itself? So what he sets out to do is to write a book that explored what Jesus means to the poor and marginalized, or who he says has their backs up against the wall, or what he calls the disinherited. So by disinherited, he means those who are generally excluded from the social, economic, and political benefits that those in the majority enjoy. What's interesting is he says it's very common to hear sermons about the preachings of Jesus talking about how to treat someone who is less fortunate than you, to be gracious, to give food or to give clothes, or a sermon about how we should be accepting and to not be oppressive. But these messages are for people who have wealth, who are part of the oppressive majority, or we might be able to say those who have the ability to oppress. But what is the message for people who have nothing, or who are being oppressed by a dominant culture? In fact, first you have to ask, is there even a message in Christianity for them? Thurman first says, well, the first thing we need to do is to realize that Jesus is the perfect person to ask, because Jesus was poor, he was a Jew, and he was under an oppressive regime. So the answer to the first question, does it have anything to say to the disinherited, would be yes. Jesus was disinherited in all of those ways. As a side note, he mentions how he used to read to his grandmother, and he realized that his grandmother, who is a former slave, disliked listening to the letters of Paul. She much preferred Jesus, and that's because she'd say white ministers always preached from Paul to justify slavery. What's interesting is that Thurman compares the two, Jesus and Paul, by saying that Paul, while technically in the minority, so a Jew, he did have Roman or majority citizenship, and he used that whenever it fit his needs. So Paul was more representative of those with privilege. We can note also that even among the minority, the Jews, Paul had a high status. Now, I'm not getting down on Paul. We can say some good things about Paul, and one is that he did leave that very high status as a Jewish authority. But the fact remains, especially when looking at this from the perspective of the underprivileged and the disinherited, Paul had some safeguards and some privilege. Jesus, on the other hand, had nothing to fall back on. His back was up against the wall, we might say. All right, so Thurman says Jesus is a good person to talk to about the problems of the disinherited. And what Jesus says, according to Thurman, is that it's not so much an outward problem that they face, it's an inward problem. And what I mean by that is that the liberation that the disinherited really needs is internal. It is internal liberation, that they discover their own personhood, they take hold of who they are, and they don't allow anyone to have control over them and the way that they think and act. That's what they need to be liberated from. They need to be liberated from what Thurman calls the three hounds of hell, which he says are fear, deception, or hypocrisy, and hate. And instead, they need to discover how to love the person that they truly are and to love others the same way. And then the rest of the book he's going to talk about these hounds of hell and what Jesus had to say about them, and then ultimately Jesus' way of love. Okay, so fear is the first hound. He says when a person has their back up against the wall, the first thing they might be tempted to feel is fear. Thurman notes here that while the fear might on the surface seem that it is it's like a physical fear, like a fear of dying or being hurt, he says the real fear is a fear of dying for nothing, or the fear that your life is meaningless. So dying without self-respect or dying without dignity. And that reminded me of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, written about the same time. In that book, Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, says the same thing about Jews in the Holocaust. He says the real need was not merely to survive, but the real need was to live with purpose or to live with meaning. So what does Jesus say to the disinherited about fear? He says, and this comes from Matthew chapter 10. By the way, this book was written, 80 years ago, so he's using the King James Version here. But Jesus says, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows." And Jesus says other such things about how we should not fear, but to seek God's kingdom, and how God looks out for those who are in need. Basically, Thurman says fear is a pathway only traveled by those who wish to stay alive, but really have no life. He says that in the religion of Jesus, fear is overcome when one realizes that they are children of God and that God cares for them. This makes them whole. It gives them dignity, and it helps them to realize that human death can't take away what is really important, and that is their dignity and purpose in life. The next hound of hell is deception. Thurman notes that deception is a natural defense mechanism found in nature. It's even written into the rules of natural selection in things like mimicry and camouflage. The person in the minority is constantly faced with this question: should we be deceptive in order to survive? He notes 2 problems with deception. The first is that deception tends to overtake you. And this made me think of a quotation I once heard by Dostoevsky, which I forgot the whole quotation, but it basically said something like, he who constantly lies becomes so comfortable with living in lies that they eventually have a hard time even recognizing the truth. So basically, if the oppressed have to start living in deception in order to stay alive, then what does it matter if they stay alive? They are losing themselves. The second problem is very similar to that first, and that is like if not be killed is the standard, and one can not be killed only by hiding in the background and not participating in society, then is it really worth it? Another thing that's interesting to note is that this is what the dominant culture hopes for. The Nazis controlling the Jews, making them focus on existence, or the Klan needing the Negro to know their place or to stay out of the mainstream or out of white society. The correct approach, according to Thurman, is not deception, but truth in everything. That is, stand up for who you are. He finds this answer in Jesus. Jesus says not to swear by anything, but let your yeses be yes and your noes be no. In Matthew 5 and later in Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, he talks about sincerity before God. It doesn't matter what you say, it matters who you are. To Thurman, the greatest consequence of this, the minority or disinherited being who they are, is that the oppressor does not have a defense for it. They have no alternative but to show who they are. He says, instead of relation between the weak and the strong, there is merely a relationship between human beings. A man is a man, no more, no less. The awareness of this fact marks a supreme moment of human dignity. And this makes me think of Martin Luther King Jr. talking about violence versus nonviolence. And one of his things against violence was, that is something that the oppressor understands. They would understand it if we went to a sit-in and someone poured a ice cream float on our head, and we turned around and tried to hit them. They could hit back. They know that language. But what Thurman is saying here, and that's what Martin Luther King Jr. would say, is what they're not ready for is for us to engage them as a person. And then that kind of forces them to show who they really are. Next, the third hound of hell is hatred. Once hatred manifests, we might say it festers. To Thurman, what happens is that hatred starts off as a good defense mechanism, especially in the poor and the marginalized. It's a way to bring them up a step in equality with the oppressor. So you might say, you can oppress me, but at least I can hate you. The problem with this, to Thurman, is that hatred becomes destructive and corrosive to the individual. In fact, he says it separates the individual from their own morals. For instance, a person may think that hitting another person or even killing them is wrong, but if you hate them, then it's all okay because somehow they deserve it. To Jesus, hatred was a death to the mind and the spirit, and it separated us from God. This is why he preached love for one's enemies. When we think of Jesus saying this, we often think of it from the context of something that needs to be done to rectify a wrong. So, like, they have done something wrong and they need forgiveness. Or, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Sometimes it can even serve as a call to excuse them from their wrongs. But from the context of the minority, or from the one who is being wronged, Thurman says we should read it as a way to stand up for one's self and one's own humanity. So, for instance, the actions of the oppressor or the enemy seek to make the oppressed hate, and thus it's an act of aggression because they're seeking to make them lose their personhood. They're seeking to dehumanize them. Loving your enemies is a way to combat this and assert your right to exist. What I'm saying is to Thurman, loving your enemies is not just a moral imperative, it's a way of self-actualization. And even more than that, for the outcast and the disinherited, loving your enemies is an act of resistance. Okay, in the final chapter, Thurman talks about that which is needed for the disinherited, and that is to love. And as with Jesus, it includes the love of one's enemies, which, when talking about the privileged and underprivileged, or the majority-minority or white-black relationship, is probably the most important type of love, and of course also the hardest, which is to forgive your oppressor. In fact, he distinguishes between enemies who are in your social group and those who are not. And so you might think in his context, he's talking about the minority with other people in the minority and the majority with other people in the majority. For those who are in your social group or in your own social status, love and forgiveness are much easier. And that's because even in the worst cases, like people who you feel betrayed your group, we might think of Jews during Jesus' time and how they felt towards the Jewish tax collectors, like they were betrayed. Love and forgiveness, even in these situations, love and forgiveness have to do with an appeal to commonality, or that recognition of personhood in yourself and in the other person. You see them as a person, understand the circumstances which they came from, and maybe love and forgive them because you understand that the choices they make and have made must have been hard, and you think about the choices that you make or would make if you were in their circumstances would be equally difficult, and so you're able to find common ground. The problem, of course, is with the enemy who is not in your social group or who's not on your social level or social standing. And for the disinherited, this probably means the ones who are the oppressors or the ones who have the ability to oppress, who can use their social standings. Like you can think in Jesus' day, like the Romans. But it could also mean those who you've just grown up to see as the enemies. For instance, in the case of the ancient Jews, you can think of the Samaritans or the Greeks or the Syrophoenicians. So if you don't remember this episode, there is a place in the Synoptic Gospels where Jesus seems to call this Syrophoenician woman a dog. So that's like an example of this. By the way, if you're interested in that, I have a video where I deal with that episode, and you can find that on my channel. If I remember, I'll see if I can link it in the description. Okay, so the answer here to all of these quote-unquote enemies, these who are in a different social setting, is exactly what you might think. It's kind of the same answer with those who are in a social setting. Since they're not in your social group and you do not see them as one of you, you need to. You need to understand them as human, just like you are. They are a child of God, just like you are. Somehow their status, or the status that divides you, needs to go away. This is very easily done, usually under a shared tragedy or a time of need. So he talks about like Jesus healing the servant friend of the Roman soldier. The great despair of the soldier caused him to give up his status and to ask Jesus for help. And of course, Jesus didn't hold it over his head that, oh, I'm just a lowly Jew and we're supposed to be enemies. Jesus allowed the relationship to be mended. But other than that, other than times of great need or distress, Thurman says that we need to look for opportunities to encounter each other as equals. By the way, here he puts a plug in for why segregation is such a bad idea. And that's because it doesn't provide for opportunities for black people and white people to encounter each other in an authentic way. This brought to my mind, by the way, public schools. I was a public school teacher for 20 years, and I can say from the inside, there are many problems with the public school system, in my opinion. However, one of the great strengths, and probably, again, in my opinion, the greatest strength, is the leveling out of students' statuses. That creates plenty of opportunities for authentic relationships. Even, by the way, for the children who were raised in possibly racist homes, students get to experience one another as people before those barriers are even made. And if the barriers are there, they get to see one another as people without the hindrance of those barriers. Okay, on my channel, I've summarized many books by the black theologian James Cone, who published his seminal book, Black Theology and Black Power, 20 years after Thurman released Jesus and the Disinherited. And so as I was reading this book, I kept thinking about Cone's work, and to me, that really helped me to understand both theologians better. Both of these authors are dealing with the problem of why Christianity is even useful for people in the minority, especially when it's often served people in the majority who sought to justify things like slavery and lynchings in the name of Jesus. However, Cone and Thurman wrote into different times. Thurman was born shortly after slavery ended. He grew up with a grandmother who was a slave and wrote at the time of Jim Crow. Cone grew up under Jim Crow and wrote shortly after the Civil Rights Movement and the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. In some ways, their ideas of how to deal with this problem are very different, but both of them ultimately agree that the religion of Jesus is still valid. It's still a valid religion for the oppressed, and it has much to say to them. So it hasn't just become a religion of the oppressors, which it definitely has become, like I said, with people who are using it to lynch and to hate. Specifically, to both of them, they see that at the core of Jesus' message is a need for personhood and dignity. For them, the oppressed, specifically black people in America, must reclaim their identity and humanity in a society that seeks to deny it. Both theologians see Christianity as a liberating force for the oppressed. In their view, the message of Jesus is fundamentally one of liberation from oppression, affirming that the oppressed are fully human, endowed with inherent worth, and equal to all others. Thurman and Cone both emphasize that Jesus' teachings call for the restoration of dignity and justice, and that it challenges these systems that dehumanize them. So basically what I'm saying is that for both, they both insist that the disinherited must reclaim their humanity and that this is what Christianity offers. For Thurman, however, the ultimate job of the oppressed is not just to recognize this internal worth in themselves, but in order to be fully and truly liberated, they must ultimately recognize it in their enemies. Okay, that is my summary of Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, subscribe to my channel. If you didn't, well, I guess not everyone can be a home run.